Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are well and safe at home. Welcome to our conference. It's a pleasure to have you here. The idea of this panel is to discuss a little bit the alternatives for the taxpayers to settle and negotiate tax debts with the tax authorities. We will address some issues, some pros and cons, and some precautions that the taxpayers must have before entering into an agreement with the tax authorities. This type of discussion is quite new in Brazil, but we know that in Europe, in the US, and Latin America as well, is more common. So it will be very interesting to discuss how the countries differentiate this type of discussion. Before introducing the speakers, my colleagues from the other countries, I would like just to mention that we have a Q&A, so please feel free to send us questions. It will be a pleasure to answer them during the session or even after that. There is a button of Q&A, so please feel free. And also, I would like to mention that we are launching today an electronic book contemplating international tax matters. The book was written by the partners in the tax department of Trent Ross Watanabe. The book is available in our website, trentross.com, and it is at no cost. So please feel free. I hope you enjoy. My name is Rafael Gregorin. I'm a tax partner from Trent Ross Watanabe in the São Paulo office. Again, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I hope everybody can enjoy the session. I have with me my colleagues, and I want to say thank you guys for joining. Maria Rita Ferragutti from the São Paulo office. We also have Caroline Silberstein from France. Caroline, I hope that I pronounced your name correctly. I also have Jorge Narvaez from Mexico and Robert Albarrao from the US. Again, thank you guys for joining. So, settlement with the tax authorities. I know, Maria Rita, that this is a very hot topic in Brazil nowadays. We have been discussing that for almost 20 years. So I would like to ask you, is this for real? Is this happening in Brazil? So if you can give us like an overview, I would appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. It's a pleasure to talk to all of you. I'd like to say that I feel very happy because of the subject of this panel. Not long ago, negotiating with tax authorities would be totally unthinkable for us. But now in Brazil, it is possible to negotiate in two different ways. The first one, since 2015, we have the legal procedure arrangement rules, what we call negócio jurídico processual. And second, since the end of 2019, transaction. We know that in Brazil, we have a very complex jurisdiction, and there is no tradition in negotiations between taxpayers and the government. Disputes have been always decided by the court, in the courts. So for us, this is a new and a very important scenario. To show you what I mean, I'd like to present some numbers of 2018. First, Brazilian tax litigation is equivalent to 73% of the gross domestic product. 80 million pending cases in the Brazilian judiciary. Yes, I said 80 million. 114 tax matters in Supreme Court. An average of 18 years from the beginning to the end of a tax discussion. And for each tax dispute, up to 75 people may get involved. As you can see, this is not a good picture. But then the question is, why do we end up in this situation? I believe, Rafael, there are three main reasons that I would like to share with you. The first one is the complexity of our legislation. Then, excessive constitutional discussion of tax matters, and finally, litigation culture. But now it's time to change. This is the point. Negotiation between tax authorities and taxpayers is practiced in many countries, and it does not represent a risk of compliance. Besides that, Brazil depends on foreign investment. With a complex tax system and high litigation, the country's image abroad is undermined. So Brazil really needs a tax reform, self-composition, and less litigation. This is the point, okay? Well, now I'd like to talk a little bit about the two types of settlements I've mentioned at the beginning. Nowadays, the negotiation may not start before the taxpayers receive the notice of a tax assessment or declare the debt. In both cases, the debt must be already with the federal attorneys, which means that the administrative discussion is already finished. Until now, it is not possible to negotiate with IRS. Through the legal procedural arrangement rules, federal attorneys and taxpayer may negotiate some legal proceedings, such as combination of guarantees, conditions for evaluation, replacement, and releasing of guarantees, payment plan, expert evidence, and so on. It's important to highlight that the settlement must also be appealing to the government, and to be effective, the negotiation must be confirmed by the judiciary. So, regarding the transaction, since the end of last year, taxpayers who don't hold criminal records may undertake a tax transaction with the federal attorneys, with the purpose of negotiating favorable conditions for payment of tax debts. The legislation foresees two types of tax transactions. One, by adherence, when settlement is proposed by the government, and two, by individual negotiations, when federal attorneys and taxpayer reach an individual agreement in relation to the extent of the discount, the dates for payment, and the guarantees, for example. Both parties may propose the settlement, and it applies to debts above 15 million reais. Finally, please bear in mind that the negotiation with the authorities does not mean that the taxpayer doesn't have a good case. There are several reasons not connected to the merit of the case to why a negotiation may take place, such as the urgent need for a tax clearance certificate, what is very common situation in Brazil, reducing legal costs and releasing guarantees. So basically, this is a good introduction about our system. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Rita. It's very good to know that we are changing, Brazil is changing. I hope we can have opportunities to negotiate with the tax authorities. And I know that you are involved in a lot of discussion with the tax authorities. I hope that they can listen to you and we can change this scenario. Jorge, my friend, Mexico. I know that Mexico was one of the first countries in Latin America to introduce this type of settlements. So you can give us a brief scenario of Mexico.
Yes, of course. Yes. Hello, everybody. Yeah, in Mexico, a few years ago, there was an amendment to the tax code. The idea of that amendment was to introduce for the first time ever an alternative tax dispute resolution procedure. It is called in Mexico Acuerdo Conclusivo, conclusive agreement. This was an idea that was generated by the Mexican tax ombudsman and was discussed with the tax authorities at the time, Congress, and they all agreed that this might be a good idea to settle cases and avoid long tax dispute processes. So here, what we have is an idea today, a very positive idea. In practice, has been applied, implemented very favorably to taxpayers and also to tax authorities. Because let me tell you that in terms of this procedure, taxpayers not only have saved money, okay, but also tax authorities have collected lots of money. Instead of waiting 10 years, 8 years to collect something, and I don't know if they were going to be really collecting that, today, in terms of this process, when you reach a settlement, the taxpayer pays less and the tax authorities collect something. Based upon recent numbers during the last years, we can see that this process has favored both taxpayers and tax authorities. So this is a win-win. What is happening with this procedure? Well, it is a settlement, and the taxpayers are entitled to file for this alternative tax dispute mechanism only during the audit, okay? If the audit concludes and no filing of this ADR was made, then the taxpayers are not entitled to seek for a settlement in terms of this process. So this process permits taxpayers that are undergoing an audit to file this administrative alternative tax dispute resolution mechanism. At the moment that this procedure is filed, the audit is automatically suspended. And then the parties, the tax administration, the taxpayer, and the tax ombudsman will sit to discuss the facts, the merits, and the legal interpretation with the aim to reach a settlement. This is not a settlement telling, okay, if I owe you 100, I'm gonna pay you 15 or 20. No, this is not a type of settlement. The settlement is made upon the analysis of the facts and circumstances and the applicable law. And what is important here is that it departs from the very formalistic approach the tax authorities have taken in analyzing the matter, and now it includes the materiality of the facts, of the circumstances, the substance of the matter. So based upon these procedures, taxpayers and tax authorities can reach an understanding of what really happened, okay? Not from a very formalistic point of view, but from a substantive point of view. And that has proven to be very effective. Another incentive is that taxpayers that apply for the first time, file for the first time this type of remedy, this type of procedures, would be entitled to have a full pardon of fines just for one time of the fines that at the end would be applicable. So we can discuss later what other possible aspects of this process for you to understand. This has also been widely acclaimed by many other jurisdictions that have tried to mirror what we have been doing, because it's a pretty straightforward process, very simple, and has proven to be very effective. Thank you, Rafael.
Thank you, Jorge. It's nice to hear that it's a win-win position, because as we know, in Latin America, it's very frequent, the disputes. So when you have this type of opportunity, you can also decrease the numbers of litigation. So it's good to know. Caroline, how about France? Is it common? It's a procedure common to negotiate with the tax authorities?
Yes, thank you, Rafael. In effect, in France, it is very common. Settlement is a fully integrated part of the audit process. It is absolutely standard practice to negotiate the tax assessments with the French tax administration during what we call the administrative part of the settlement, which is something at the end of the audit and before litigation. Just to give you a few statistics, in 2019, 27% of the audit cases included penalties above 40%, 40% or more than 40%. And if you have a company that incurs a 40% penalty twice in a period of 6 years, the case will be systematically forwarded to the public prosecutor with possible criminal consequences. So you can understand that under these conditions, having the possibility to have a dialogue at the administrative level is very important. In France, what happens when you have an audit is that you have the audit phase on site, then the taxpayer receives a notice of proposed assessment from the tax authority, has the opportunity to have a response in writing to the tax administration and from the tax administration, and this is a dialogue with the tax inspector. But at the end of this dialogue, you have the possibility to have another dialogue with the chief of brigade, who is the hierarchical superior of the tax inspector. And if this is not sufficient, at an even higher level, which is called the interlocutor, which is here to try to resolve the cases before they go to court.
Thank you, Caroline. Robert, in the US, we always hear in Brazil that when we are talking with the tax authorities, we tell them, look, in the US, they are always able, the taxpayers are able to go there to discuss with the tax authorities. So it's something that works. Is that true? You can go there and really discuss with the tax authorities?
Yes, that's very much true, Raphael. And again, thank you for having me participate in the panel today. The United States sounds very similar to France, the way Caroline was describing it. First of all, large corporate taxpayers are audited in the United States. So there's typically an opportunity to speak with the examination team during the course of an audit to see if you might be able to resolve issues as they come up. So there's informal discussions that occur along the way. The vast majority, and I mean 90+% of all examinations are ultimately resolved without the need of litigation in the US. And there's opportunities to discuss the merits of the case along the way. Again, it sounds similar to France. So there's 3 steps to a tax dispute in the United States. There's first the audit or the examination. Then there's the administrative appeals process that, again, sounds similar to France. And if you're unable to reach resolution at that level, on to litigation. And during any one of those phases, settlement discussions can occur to try to resolve issues. Most of the cases are resolved at that middle tier level, that is at what we call administrative appeals. And that's a body within the Internal Revenue Service that's designed to resolve cases short of litigation. But even if a case ultimately can't be resolved at that level, cases then get docketed in court, and there can still be substantive settlement discussions with counsel before a case actually has to go to trial. And many cases are resolved at that level as well. One of the questions here is, does it mean that the taxpayer does not have a good case if the issues are resolved? The answer is no, not at all. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of resolving cases short of litigation in a moment. But it certainly doesn't mean that the taxpayer has a bad case, because again, the vast majority of cases are resolved without the need for litigation in the United States.
Thank you, Robert. That's interesting. Well, we know that a lot of taxpayers are concerned about entering into an agreement with the tax authorities because you always bring their attention, you always bring their into home. So a lot of taxpayers are concerned. Maria Rita, if you can mention like the pros and cons in discussing with them, what would you say?
Thank you again, Rafael. Well, for the time being, we may consider there are many pros of a tax transaction. I'd like to point out 6 of them. 1, reduction of up to 50% of the total debt. 2, as a general rule, reductions apply to fines, interest, and public attorney fees. There are only 2 cases where the reduction applies also to the principal amount, okay? And 3, payment installments up to 84 months. 4, it is not necessary to split up all debts, although there are some restrictions. And 5, there is room for negotiating the acceptance, replacement, and releasing enough guarantees. And 6, possibility of paying the debt using owned or third-party judiciary bonds. As you can see, the pros are quite significant. But of course, there are also some negative points that I would like to mention. The first one, little discount for taxpayer with good payment capacity. And this is an important point. Next, in one case, withdrawal of the discussion of the matter at administrative and judicial courts. The third one is the kind of information that may be provided, as I mentioned afterwards. And finally, although permitted by law, so far we have no regulation for the transaction of large tax theses, which may be interesting for the largest taxpayers. Despite that, we believe and hope that soon we'll have a regulation, Well, moving on, regarding to the legal procedure arrangement, the pros are also very important. We believe that all companies with a large tax litigation should take this opportunity into consideration. This is a great possibility for the reduction of unnecessary litigation. I really believe on that, Rafael. And then we have, as example, possibility to avoid early execution of guarantees and cash deposit requirements. Good chance of getting the mix of guarantees accepted. Better understanding of the context in which the taxpayer and the debt are inserted. And also, it's a great opportunity to decrease the duration and the costs of the judicial actions. And finally, in my point of view, there is no disadvantage, okay? Now, with respect to the information that the taxpayer is supposed to provide, all types of information related to tax or accounting matters may be provided if requested by the tax authorities. I'll give you some examples. Balance sheet, cash flow, description of the economic group, list of creditors and assets, locally and overseas financial investments, and information regarding directors and managers. Finally, if the settlement is not concluded, the taxpayer is still able to litigate. Thank you very much, and over to you again, Rafael.
Thank you, Maria Rita. What about Mexico, Jorge? Pros and cons, what would you mention? I think you are in mute.
Yes, Rafael, thank you. Yeah, I would say that it's pretty much everything is positive with this procedure in Mexico. This procedure is, the spirit is for this process to be efficient, expeditious, and flexible, okay? So, and also attractive. It motivates, incentivizes taxpayers to go there and apply for it. As mentioned before, for the first time, taxpayers apply for it would be having a burden of fines that at the end would be, in terms of the outcome of the agreement, would be payable. They would be pardoned. Also, this would permit avoid litigation, okay, as we mentioned before. It could last many years litigation. This would permit to look into the substance and materiality of the matter, not only on the formal aspects of this. It's very important, whatever conclusion reached in this ADR, in this Acuerdo Conclusivo, Alternative Tax Dispute Mechanism, does not create any precedent for the taxpayer. So it may conclude something this year in terms of this process, and it cannot be used by the authorities to audit subsequent years and try to reach the same result. So it does not create any precedent. I think it's a very flexible process. The type of documentation is agreed among the parties, and it permits a very clear explanation, opportunities for the parties to explain their positions. There are several technical meetings among the taxpayers, tax authorities, and the tax ombudsman in order to determine the real interpretation of the facts and the interpretation of the law applicable to those facts. Also, the audit is suspended once this ADR is filed. Once the ADR is concluded, and they should not last for more than 9 or 12 months. So this is a very short period. In many cases, they conclude much earlier than that. Once the ADR is concluded, there is a minute reflecting the agreement between the tax authorities and the taxpayer. And then this agreement is, the audit is resumed, and the auditors take into account these minutes of this agreement and reflect those minutes in the final resolution of the audit. So the audit is closed, reflecting what has been discussed in the ADR process with the tax authorities. So this is a very good process indeed. I've been telling my clients for several years now that in case of a tax dispute, this is the first stop they should make and think seriously about this process. Thank you.
And Jorge, one question. You mentioned that you do not create a precedent, but are they public? Other taxpayers can have access to the result of this type of negotiation?
No. This is taxpayers and the tax authorities and the ombudsman.
Okay.
Those are not public records, yeah.
Great, thank you, Jorge. Caroline, you mentioned that the procedure is very common in France, so I'm assuming that there are a lot of pros. So can you comment on that, please?
Yes, thank you, Rafael. The situation in France, in fact, is very similar to the one in Mexico. First of all, there are only pros in engaging into that dialogue with the tax authorities, because engaging in that dialogue does not mean that you will necessarily have to agree to a settlement. So it's always better to try to arrive at a solution. If you do not arrive at a solution which is satisfactory to the company, you still have the possibility to say that you want to litigate and not agree on a settlement. So it is not a problem to engage into this procedure. Secondly, this is a possibility which is offered to the taxpayer, and until this phase of negotiation is finalized, there will be no call for payment of the tax, which means that from a treasury perspective, from a cash perspective, it is generally in the best interest of the company to enter also into this negotiation phase. Also, the negotiation phase takes place with some individuals which are higher ranking within the tax administration, which may have a broader view because they have seen maybe more policy considerations, more taxpayers, and typically the quality of the dialogue and the willingness from those individuals to try to arrive at a solution instead of going to litigation will be greater than the one of a typical tax inspector. So only advantages in terms of the type of information that the taxpayer is supposed to provide to negotiate. There is no rule, there is no checklist. Typically, this would be the same information as already provided in the course of the audit, except that you still have the possibility to bring in some new elements, especially As I indicated earlier, the first stage of negotiation will be with the chief of brigade, who is the direct manager, direct report of the tax inspector, and has already agreed to the notice of proposed assessment. So in order to convince those levels to agree to a better settlement or a better position than the one which is in the NOPA, in the notice of proposed assessment, it is possible to bring in new elements to clarify some position, for instance, which was not correctly understood by the tax inspector. This is something quite common, for instance, in transfer pricing. Once a settlement is concluded, the taxpayer has to give up litigation. It is either or. Either you settle or you litigate. However, in principle, the fact that a settlement would be concluded would not refrain from the right to go to mutual agreement procedure in the case where double taxation is involved. So for instance, if you have a company that reaches a settlement for transfer pricing assessment in France, it should still be able to request elimination of double taxation with the other country by bringing the case to the competent authorities. That's the theory. It is true that in practice, we have seen cases where, as part of the settlement, the tax authorities request the taxpayer to give up mutual agreement procedure, and that could be a disadvantage that has to be weighed in order to decide whether or not to accept a settlement.
Well, seems very interesting, Caroline, and it seems fair as well. So I hope we can have like a system in Brazil similar to France. And Robert, what about the US? If you can comment on...
Go ahead, please.
No, I would say if you can comment on publicity as well. I don't know if the deals are public or not.
Yes, in fact, that's one of the primary concerns or considerations, Raphael, in determining whether or not to take a case in the United States into litigation. As long as you're in the administrative process in the United States, it's all private. So taxpayer information or the results of settlement discussions, that kind of thing in the United States is all private, and no other taxpayers can gain access to that information. In sharp contrast to that, once you get into litigation, there's public filings, of course, then everybody knows about it because it's a matter of public record. And here over the last decade or so, it seems tax cases have gotten a lot more play in the newspapers even and in the press than they ever had before. And so what we used to call the Wall Street Journal test is now maybe different, and it's on CNN or whatnot. But if you don't want your case to show up in the Wall Street Journal, you want it beforehand through an administrative settlement. So that's certainly one of the biggest concerns in the United States around large corporate taxpayers disputing their tax obligations literally in public. And in a lot of instances, you hear corporations, not paying their fair share, that kind of thing. That comes up in the context of public tax litigation often. So that's certainly one consideration that's very top of mind for corporations. The other thing is just the sheer expense and time that's consumed with tax litigation. Tax litigation can be very expensive in the United States. It can take up a lot of time of your senior executives and the like, particularly in significant transfer pricing cases. So to avoid time and expense associated with litigation, that's one of the pros of trying to resolve things administratively. And finally, I mentioned, depending on what forum you go to litigate a case, looking at the last question there, if you're unable to resolve a case through a settlement, again, the vast majority are resolved that way. Depending on what forum you choose to litigate your case, you can be required to pay the tax before you actually enter into the litigation. There's one forum that most taxpayers go to called the United States Tax Court, where you don't have to pay in advance, but really the amount at issue and the precedents in the particular courts can make that determination as well.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. Very interesting. So I think one of the major concern of the companies is related to whether other companies within the same group can be reached, can be influenced by this type of agreement, and also the legal representatives. Can the legal representatives be affected by this type of settlement with the tax authorities? So Maria Rita, I would like you to comment on that. And if you can, I would ask you to comment on corruption as well. I think it's a difficult topic, but we know that these settlements in Brazil, for a long time, there was a lot of debate because of corruption. So if you can just cover this type of topic, I would appreciate, please.
Okay, hi again. Well, the settlements are quite new in Brazil. It seems to us that the federal attorneys can send, Rafael, the information to the tax authorities in order to allow them to analyze documents and, if this is the case, to issue assessments against the company or even against the directors who provided personal documents. Our understanding is based on the fact that the tax authorities have the right to issue an assessment whenever they find relevant information. Although it seems to be a negative point of the settlements, this is a point, okay? We need to consider that the federal authorities already have full access to the most of the information that the taxpayer will be required to provide. In addition, for the ones they do not have, for example, investments overseas, they could be obtained. So this is what we have to take into consideration. Last month, I participated on a debate with the federal prosecutors, and their answer for this question was that they will not use the information for other processes rather than the ones that are under negotiation. We were talking about economic groups. To listen to that was very positive, but at the same time, this is a sensitive point of the settlement, and it needs to be considered to everyone, okay? I would also like to point out that it's important to highlight that the settlements may reach not only the taxpayer, but also companies from the same economic group or even third parties, which include taxpayers' legal representatives, according to our domestic legislation regarding joint liability. Again, this is a negative point, but when we study the Brazilian legislation, we understand that it's more positive than negative, because they can be reached, but they can defend themselves as well. And this is not an open possibility. The legislation about negotiations give some keys of what the federal prosecutors can do and what they don't. So it's not like an open page, okay? I don't believe really that this will be a big deal in the future. I still thinking that we have a great chance in front of us and we should consider, okay? Now, you mentioned corruption, Rafael, and this is very interesting because we live in a country, this is an issue that needs to be considered, okay? And as I have listened to our colleagues here, I noticed that in their countries, United States, France, Mexico, the settlements are not public. In Brazil, they are. And I believe that the main reason for it is the risk of corruption, okay? But again, we need to understand a little bit more about the legislation. The confidential information of the taxpayer will be preserved. So it's not because it's public that all the information will be in the newspaper, okay? There's a difference. But what they are doing is they're publishing all the information regarding the taxpayer name and the amount involved in the kind of transaction or any kind of settlement they are doing. Okay, but they publish, yes, you can see now if a company is getting into a settlement with the federal attorneys. It is possible. Although, besides that, I think the settlements are being very successful, and the fact of being public is not as negative as it would be if we couldn't have this kind of chances of dialogue with the public attorneys. Okay, so I would like to bring a last number that show what I mean. The successful of being with the legislation we have now. It's a very positive situation for us. Listen, until the end of July, 55,000 transactions were formalized, adding up to a total amount of 18.8 billion reais in tax debt. It means success, okay? The majority of the transaction involved amounts up to 5 million reais. I know that for the big companies, that's not much, but still, for Brazil, it's a great way of settlement, okay? And so I finish here like saying that I understand why all over the world, the publicity of the settlements, it's something strange. But for us, as we need to face the risk of corruption, this is something that we can deal, okay? Considering, again, that the confidential information of the taxpayer will be preserved. That's what we have now. So for me, when you think about 55,000 transactions formalized in only 6 months, it's very successful. So I think we need to keep going. Okay?
Yeah, it's a huge number, Maria Rita. It's a good point, and the fact that the information is going to be published, it's a good point as well, because at least it cannot eliminate, but at least mitigate the risk of corruption. So it's a hope. Let's see. Jorge, in Mexico, I know the country is similar to Brazil in all aspects. So about corruption, you guys mentioned that the system works, but did you face a lot of types of corruption, a lot of situations of corruption until the system goes well?
No, the system has worked very well. There are lots of instances that protect this process. The tax administration, the auditors, or the people in the administration that are participating in this process need to do it just by the book, because there is an internal section at the Mexican Treasury overseeing what they are doing. So, for instance, if they are just coming up with this settlement that is totally outrageous without any basis, that will be reviewed by the tax authorities, and there is a possibility to input some liability, responsibility to the official in the tax administration that agree to the specific terms of the agreement. So it is, and also you have the people at the Mexican Tax Ombudsman that participate in this process. They are pre-professionals. They know exactly what they do, and they avoid all types of possibilities for this type of corruption, or any type of corruption to take place during these processes. All the meetings are in the open. All the meetings are captured through the corresponding minutes. In all the meetings, you have the taxpayer, the tax administration, and the tax ombudsman present. It is prohibited that the tax administration talks in private to the taxpayer during this process, because if that happens, the ADR, the settlement process, would be concluded, okay? So there are several instances and protections for this process to continue be performing honestly. Going to the other questions, if this type of processes, settlements, bring more adverse scenarios to the taxpayer, no, I don't think so. If, for instance, the taxpayer and the authorities do not reach any type of agreement, the question is if the tax authorities could use the additional information presented by the taxpayer in the subsequent stages of administrative appeals or tax litigation. Well, what we recommend is to start this process at the very end of the audit. Once the oficio observaciones is the observations letter is notified within the audit to the taxpayer. In this letter of observations, the tax authorities have already reviewed all that they had to review and interpreted all that was possible to interpret by them. So now the taxpayer is not now just allowed to respond to that observation letter to challenge the statements or conclusions reached by the tax administration. So once you pass this stage of the observations letter, is when we recommend to file the alternative tax dispute resolution, and then you file it and the audit will be suspended. And you work with all that the tax authorities already have at hand, and they cannot come up with additional aspects of that. And finally, I think that this has proven to be very effective as well for the taxpayer, and not only for the tax year under audit. Let's assume that you have a transaction that transcends the audited tax year, or you have a business model that is being used by the taxpayer, not only in the tax year under audit, but in connection with also in connection with other subsequent years. What we have done very successfully is to file the ADR for the audited year and tell the authorities, okay, why don't we reach a multi-year settlement, because this is the same business model, okay? And instead of auditing the taxpayer once again and once again, no, we can just reach a settlement for all the open years through a specific mechanism, which is the tax administration and the tax ombudsman will start open small audits, if you want to fast track audits for all those years. But in essence, what's happening here is that the conclusions reached for the year under audit will be reflected in connection with the other years where the taxpayer used the same business model. Of course, the numbers will be changed, but you can reach a good settlement, a package settlement. And this has been proven to be very effective. The tax authorities are very happy because they collect more than they expected. And the taxpayers are happy because they have paid less than they might have paid if they continue the route of litigation or something like that. Even if they might win it, sometimes it's better just to cut the losses short and make some payments, and the tax authorities think the same. So I think it's very, very convenient. And there is no harm to directors or managers in undertaking these processes. They are required to appear in all these meetings. They need to have very substantial authority sign on these meetings because the resolutions would be very relevant. But that would be the only thing that we need to be careful, just to confirm that they have enough. So this is really what happens in this connection with these processes in Mexico.
Thank you, Jorge. Caroline, I don't know if corruption is a big issue in France, but I would like also to hear from you with relation to criminal aspects. If you have like a deal and the legal representative is involved, if you settle with the tax authorities, will the criminal responsibility go away as well, or how does it work?
Yes, thanks, Rafael. So first of all, I would like to say that most of the comments concerning Mexico are quite similar for the situation in France, and typically the settlement negotiation will not bring a more adverse scenario to the taxpayer. Also, because it is possible that in a tax audit you have, for instance, 5 items on which you have an assessment received from the tax authority, and you may reach a good settlement on 2 of those items. For the 3 other items, you don't get a good agreement with the tax authority, and you can decide to settle on 2 and to pursue litigation on the 3 others. So it's very flexible, and I cannot think of cases where the outcome would be more adverse than not having at least tried the settlement route. On the question whether the settlement will be only for the main taxpayer, it is very flexible. If you have a settlement, it is normally related to the company that has been audited, to the taxpayer that has been audited, and typically it is not binding on other taxpayers, even related companies within the same country, within the same tax group. But there might be some flexibility in some cases where the same transactions are being undertaken by several taxpayers. You might have a possibility to expand the settlement to other entities, and as was described for Mexico, the settlement typically is for the past, for the audited years, but in some cases we have been able to agree on the same basis for the future years, or for years which are also past years but have not been audited yet. So that was in some cases something favorable for the taxpayer. Concerning your question with respect to criminal prosecutions, it depends. I mean, it's going to be very complicated and very challenging to reach a settlement in a case where there is a threat of criminal prosecutions, because if we are in a case where the tax administration considers that there is fraud, for instance, they may not be willing to agree on a settlement with the taxpayer. And once we are in the following phase, that is, the criminal prosecution has already been confirmed, then there is another type of possible negotiation that involves the prosecutor part and the criminal part of the procedure, which is different and separated from the pure, from the mere tax discussion, for the taxation, for the discussion with the taxation authorities only. Until today, criminal prosecutions are relatively rare, but this is something which is increasing in number because of the environment concerning the fight against the tax evasion, and the fact also that since a couple of years, when 40% or above penalties have been imposed on the taxpayer, the case will be automatically forwarded to the public prosecutor. So this is definitely something to monitor.
Interesting. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you a lot. Robert, what about the US? We always hear that the criminal legislation is tough in the US and so on. So if you can comment on the questions and also on the criminal responsibility, I would appreciate. Thank you.
Certainly. Just walking through the questions very quickly, Rafael, in light of the time. I mean, the information that's provided during the course of an audit or during the administrative appeals process and settlement discussions continues to be private, what we call tax return information. And even the examination teams and the IRS has criminal rules around their, if they were to expose documents or the like to the public. There's rules that would catch that kind of thing. So documents themselves and information are maintained as private. However, they can be used in subsequent audits of the same taxpayer. So it's often the case, similar in Mexico that Jorge was describing, where you have the same type of business model in consecutive years. The Internal Revenue Service can take an approach that would be, as can the taxpayer. You can utilize similar arguments and documents and the like in multiple years. So there's quite a bit of flexibility around that. Just again, in the interest of time, you mentioned the criminal aspect. There's not any real significance to the legal representatives or directors around settlement negotiations or settlements that are reached. As we said early on, they're not a matter of public record. They're all private. But absent, an alleged breach of fiduciary duty or the like on the part of a board member or legal representative or something along those lines, by and large, you don't see many instances, if at all, of any criminal exposure to people that are conducting the negotiations in the United States.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you a lot. I think we were able to give an overview on the countries, how the transactions and the negotiations work. So we are almost run of time. Maria Rita, if we can ask you in 30 seconds to give your final recommendation, please.
Okay. First, I'd like to say that it was a pleasure to talk to all of you. And my final considerations are that the possibility of a fruitful dialogue with the federal attorneys is valuable for everyone. Please bear this in mind, okay? And also, I hope that in the near future, the Brazilian scenario will improve even more, and you have the possibility of negotiating with IRS, as well as you have a law for arbitration in tax matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jorge.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, the same. I think that the takeaway from Mexican perspective is that the acuerdo conclusivo, this alternative tax dispute mechanism in Mexico, is in tax audits. It would be a waste, a huge waste of opportunity not to undertake this process in case you pass.
I think the internet's cutting a little bit, Jorge. So I will pass to Caroline to say like the final words, please.
Is they cut the losses short.
Go ahead, Caroline. Thank you, Jorge.
Thank you. Yes, I believe that on a global basis, given the increase in the number of tax disputes, the amount at stake and the complexity of these disputes, and also given that litigation takes many years, typically 6 years in France before you get a Supreme Court decision, the possibility to settle and negotiate with tax authorities has to be part of the dispute resolution mechanisms. It is not perfect because you don't get a principled solution, you get a negotiated solution, and sometimes it does not resolve your problems on the long term, but at least it's expeditious and it's very precious to have this possibility.
Thank you.
And thanks for having me on this conference.
Our pleasure. Thank you, Robert.
Yes, just very quickly, Raphael, I guess the one thing we do a lot of work with clients is around preparation for the audit and in effect preparing for the settlement discussions before you even get to that point. So as significant transactions are done, a lot of the work we do is in anticipation of the audit, making sure the files are all in order, making sure that you have records of the various employees that worked on particular transactions, et cetera, so that when the audit begins, you're in effect ready to start providing information and enter into those settlement discussions as soon as practical. So preparation, I guess would be my tip for everybody on the phone.
Thank you, Robert. Well, thank you for the speakers, Maria Rita, Caroline, Jorge, and Robert. It was a pleasure to have you all here. I think it was very interesting. Of course, we can stay here hours to debate, but it was really great. Thank you. And thank you for the audience. If you guys have any questions, it will be a pleasure to answer those. So let us know. And thank you again for participating, for joining. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.